All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming in. Great to see you all here. Just a reminder to sign in. It's just how we get reimbursed, so we can continue to run these events. For BCO, they won't reimburse us. Thanks everyone for coming. This is a talk that we have wanted to do for a while because a lot of people know that they're interested in intellectual property, but once you kind of get into that field, a lot of times people are really not sure on which path to pursue, whether it's litigation or prosecution. And so we invited Dr. Sanker here to give a talk, and if you haven't met him already, he's a great mentor and a huge proponent, or a huge advocate of Berkeley, the larger campus, and Berkeley law in general. So overall fantastic person, and we're very lucky to have him. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It seems like somehow we're more heavily weighted on that side of it. That'll be okay. So today's presentation will be quite interesting, and you'll see the slides don't have very much substance. It's just going to introduce a specific little topic, and then we're going to talk about it. So let's just start here. Quick background for me. So I actually was here at Berkeley 40 years ago, if you can believe that, to start my PhD program in math. I did that. Then I taught math for 3 years. Then I went into software development for 12 years. And about the end of that, I said, yeah, I need to do something different. And it turned out that the thing that was different was to go into law, specifically patent law. And so I have worked at Morgan Lewis since then, initially as an associate, and then the last 5 years as a partner. And during that time, which is relevant to discussion today, I have worked in both litigation, patent litigation, and patent prosecution. So I actually have experience in both, and I think I can help you get a few ideas about how to think about the decision, because I think a lot of times you don't really know enough to even know necessarily what questions to ask. And so I'm going to try to do a little of that today. And before we start, I thought I'd ask this question. High school students, when they're going off to college, they sometimes visit campuses and then make informed decisions about what school they want to go to. And does anybody know what the most, if you try to do a statistical correlation, what factor is most statistically correlated with the school that they choose? What's that? No. Ranking would be good. It's not it. Weather, yes. Bonus points for him. It's the weather on the day that they visited the campus. It's like, wow. I mean, but it's true. The statistics show that. And it's like, well, was that really a good decision maker? And people are probably not even aware of it, but it's just kind of, it gets into your feeling about, well, I didn't feel that good about this, and it just kind of it builds in it. So, and we don't want to make the same decision about whether to go into patent prosecution or patent litigation based upon similarly not very relevant factors. So let's go on from here. And here's a good question before we get started too. It's like, what do you think is the single most important factor in your career decision? And this is a serious question. What's the single most important factor? More important than anything else? Location? Location is relevant, of course, because you want to be where you're happy. But like in the Bay Area, there's, even if we speak to law, there's a bunch of law firms, good law firms in the Bay Area. So, you could go to lots of, near where I work, that's like every big law firm has an office in Palo Alto and things. So location doesn't really matter.
Vocational fulfillment.
You're sort of on the right track, but it's but that's still kind of vague. How do you measure that? Well, what I say is that the single most important thing is actually the people that you're going to be working with. it's actually more important than the specific work you're doing is making sure that you find people that you actually enjoy working with, because you're going to be spending a lot of time with those people, and you better make sure that you're happy with that. Because if you're not, that's being happy is ultimately the critical thing. It's like how does that happen, and it's the people you work with. So that's a big factor. But that's true, whether you're thinking of law or anything else. So now let's go specifically more into factors that are relevant to thinking about patent litigation versus patent prosecution. And so let's go through some of these factors and just kind of talk about them a little bit. Technical education. So this can be a really critical factor, because if you don't have a technical degree at all, like if your degree was in a political science or something like that, then you really don't have an option to go into patent prosecution. So, but on the other hand, patent litigation involves lots of people who do not have technical degrees. So patent litigation is still fine as long as you enjoy technology. Okay, so that's one thing. It's like, if you don't have the technical degree at all, you go to litigation. The other thing is, like, what about the other factor here is that some people have advanced degrees in technology. If you have a master's degree or a PhD. And one of the things that I have seen is that the people who had the motivation and interest to get an advanced degree in science and technology typically are going to favor patent prosecution, because you're dealing with, your focus is on the technology. And so, I mean, it's not 100% true, but the correlation is pretty good. In particular, if you look at the office I work at, we probably have 6 to 8 people with PhDs. All of them are in patent prosecution. None of them are in patent litigation. And so I think that that's true. So if you have an advanced degree, think about the fact that you're probably very interested in the technology, and patent prosecution gives you more focus on the technology, whereas litigation is more focused on the litigation aspects as opposed to the technology. Introvert versus extrovert, and this is very important, because we probably, each of us knows where we fall in that scale, and it's a continuum. It isn't just like it's just not just binary A or B. It's a continuum. Any guesses as to which side would be more focused on litigation, which on prosecution? It's probably pretty clear that it's like on the introverted side is more toward patent prosecution, and the litigation side is more toward patent litigation. So again, it's not universal, and if you're somewhere in the middle, it can easily go either way. But I've seen some of the people who are the top litigators, and particularly the top litigators are people who are almost always very extroverted. Me, on the other hand, I am not extroverted, and so during my time in litigation, what I found was that I didn't have the sort of extroverted skills that would be really valuable if I wanted to pursue patent litigation long term. It took me a while to figure that out. I should have figured it out sooner, but I eventually figured out, I'm just not as well suited for that. I can sit, in my office and work on things, get work done. Sometimes talk with, patent examiners or another associate. So this is a useful factor to be thinking about. Where do you fit on that continuum? Yes. So this is also a useful factor to think about, is that there are some people who are very much into being in the battle, and it's particularly people who, if you've had sometimes if you had a lot of background in sports, it's like, if you like to, with your team you want to win and you're all about winning. And if that represents how you are and enjoy battling to winning, then patent litigation is definitely the right thing, because patent prosecution, it's like, well, our goal is to get a patent application allowed, but it's not quite as exciting as, a colleague of mine at the office who just, they had a patent litigation and they won, and they, won $250 million for their client. I mean, that's, very exhilarating. And so if you want to be in the battle and winning is good. Now, the downside is that sometimes if you're in litigation, you're not going to be able to win all the time. Sometimes you're going to lose, and you better be able to deal with losing and not let it get to you too seriously. Because there's sometimes it's like, for me, losing in a big case, I would take that personally, and it would be very tough on me. So if you're going to be in litigation, you better be able to, I guess the term is like have a thick skin. It's like, when you lose, learn from it and move on. And you have to be able to do that. And then technology. So of course, technology is involved whether you're doing patent litigation or patent prosecution. But there's a difference in focus. So in patent prosecution, your focus is on the technology and figuring out what is the technology, understanding the technology, and explaining that technology to the examiner in order to get the case allowed. The other sort of ancillary part about that is that in patent prosecution, you're also dealing with the newest technology, because that's what you're filing on. Whereas in patent litigation, it's always on the order of like 10 years behind the time. So, and of course, the question is that important to you? I mean, for me, it's not that critical whether you're dealing with new technology or technology is 10 years old. As long as I'm learning something new, it's like, well, it's new to me, so therefore it's good. But for some people, it's like being on the leading edge is critical. And so if that's important to you, then patent prosecution is good. But this kind of goes back to contrasting the interest in technology with the last slide talking about the battling and winning. And that's a useful thing to think about. It's like, okay, well, what's more important to me? Is it the technology or is it the battle? And think about that, because it's a different mindset. So the top litigators are people for which battling is critical. And one of the reasons why I shifted to, now I'm doing just patent prosecution, and one of the reasons for that shift was to realize it's like, for me, the technology is the part that I value. And that's also the part that the colleagues I work with and the partners that I was working with also realized that. So they always put me on doing the infringement contentions and the invalidity contentions and other things that are just like this. Oh, David can focus on the technology because he's good at that. But we're not going to have him, arguing in front of the court or these other things that a litigator would do. So anyway, think about what's important to you. Is that like if good litigators can litigate anything, regardless of whether there's technology involved. Where some of these patent prosecutors are going to really focus on the technology. Economics, and I mean this in a slightly different sense. You got to be thinking about so the budgets between patent litigation and patent prosecution are quite different. So think about it like if you are in litigation and you're either risking to winning or losing, many millions of dollars, A typical litigation is not, you can't get into litigation without spending a few $1 million. It's just like it's cost you that much. You know, 2, 3, 5, or more, I mean, depending on how big number. So because of that, the economics are such that, you know, associates can spend the time that's needed to do a good job, because a client's not going to say, you know, I want you to do a good job, but keep the budget at this small number because I don't want you to go over that. Even if it means losing, they're not going to do that. They need to win. Of course, you still got to be somewhat efficient, but they're not going to complain if you have done a good job on preparing, preparing your infringement contention, invalidity contention, your summary judgment brief, taking depositions, whatever it is. So budgets are good for litigation, and assume that that's going to be true forever, because it's just like if you're in litigation, then the goal is to win, and the clients realize that if they want to win, they're going to pay it. Contrast that to patent prosecution. So in patent prosecution, there are a lot of options in terms of the people who can prepare a patent application for you, and including not just big law, but a lot of smaller, typically call it boutique firms that are doing just patent prosecution, and it doesn't even require a law degree to do patent prosecution. And so you have a lot of lower cost competition that can do a reasonable job. And the other thing within patent prosecution is that, what's the value of just owning one patent? Particularly if you own 100 patents or 1,000 patents, the marginal value for getting that one additional patent is not very high. Particularly, the client just sees that it's in many cases they kind of look at it as a sort of a necessary cost, but we're going to try to keep it low because, well, what am I getting out of this? And so because of that, most medium or large clients are imposing fixed fee budgets on all patent prosecution. And in many cases, the budgets we have for filing new patent application are less now than they were, say, 10 or 15 years ago. So there is a lot of pressure in patent prosecution to be very efficient. You don't have the time to say, oh, this new technology, I think this is great. I want to spend the next 10 hours reading about it. Well, if it's not relevant to what you need to do to file a patent application, you might not be able to afford to do that. So we have to focus. So the economics is such that litigation will continue to have big budgets, but patent prosecution is getting somewhat squeezed. And this is something that what I see now is that I think that this will continue. And so I actually expect to see less prosecution in big law firms than there is now. I think there's going to be more of a movement toward smaller boutique firms handling more of patent prosecution. So, I mean, it's not going to happen overnight, but I always see the trend going in that direction. Patent litigation is always going to stick with big law because your only competition is other big law, and people will just pay the rates. But patent prosecution is different. So that's just an important thing to think about. And I don't think most people realize that. So, okay. I didn't think of this. Big law. Yeah, and this is kind of follow up on what I just said, is that, and there's a couple of parts about big law. So a lot of times when the firms that come here to recruit are almost all big law. That's the big law firm, because they can afford to spend the money on recruiting. And if your goal is to do patent litigation or business transactions or that sort of thing, that'll be in big law and will be forever. And the question is like, well, is big law what you want? Because it is different. A smaller law firm can't So I've only worked at one firm that's fits into the big law category. I think for patent prosecution, smaller law firms or boutique firms are going to be become more common. Civil procedure. Was that a factor? It's actually, this is a good one just to sort of measure how much did you like civil procedure. So if civil procedure is something you enjoy and you get an H or HH in it, that's an indicator that maybe litigation is a good fit, because it's like, okay, that's something like that. Litigation is all about that. And conversely, if you say, ooh, boy, I really didn't like civil procedure, then litigation is probably not a good fit. So this one course is probably, of all the courses you take, is probably the most relevant in terms of thinking about whether you like litigation or patent prosecution. I mean, I don't know. I did okay in civil procedure. At least the federal rules of civil procedure, I thought this is kind of rational. It's like things are pretty logical. Which is maybe one thing that kind of led me to think I'd be better at litigating. So in my case, it's sort of it wasn't an accurate predictor, because I did okay in civil procedure, but it still wasn't the right fit. But I think it's still a good indicator, particularly if you not just the first semester, but there's a second semester of civil procedure. I don't know if it's required. Is the second semester required now? When I was taking it, the second semester was optional. So I mean, if you enjoyed civil procedure enough to take the second semester, that's okay. That's good. Maybe litigation is a good fit. Teamwork. How many like working on teams? A lot of people do, and it's like, and that's a big differentiator between litigation versus prosecution. In litigation, you're always on a team, and the teams can end up being quite big, depending upon the size of the litigation. And in many cases, the teams are cross geography. So like a typical litigation that my firm does would have people in 3 offices would be pretty common, and a team might have 6 to 8 or more people involved in it. So you're working together with a team of other people, and you figure out what's your role in that. And so for some people, that working on a team is really good. It's invigorating. Patent prosecution is a lot more individual work. You're sitting in your own office. You're getting work done with generally working with one partner on for a particular matter. So you got one matter, you work on something, talk to the partner about it. For prosecution, the teamwork is just a team of 2, and you're doing the bulk of the work. Once you, early on you're learning, and so there'll be more interaction. But as you get more senior, it'll be less until you get to the point where you're the person who's senior, and now you're kind of managing junior people. So if teamwork is something that you really value, then litigation is definitely something to think about. Particularly if you like working with teams, like in cross offices. For us, we got offices throughout the U.S. and throughout the world. But so we've got our people who are working with teams, in Chicago and Houston and Shanghai and in many other places. With patent prosecution, I'm working work with other people in my office. So. Work-life balance. This can be a big deal, and because this is something actually for me was the final thing that made me say, I really can't handle litigation, and said, I'm going to go full-time prosecution. And I think I'll tell you the story of what happened to me. So I was in litigation for a bunch of years, and then I was working on a case before the International Trade Commission, which has very tight deadlines. Whereas in regular district court, given litigation could take 2 or 3 years, whatever it takes. But for a case before the International Trade Commission, by statute, they have to get this done within 1 year. And so you have extremely tight deadlines. You work really hard, work late hours, and for one deadline, and then the next day, now we've got a next deadline, we've got something that's due in the next 5 days. You get that one done, it's like, now we've got something to do in the next 5 days. And so it is a very, very hard and very, very, it consumes your life. So one of the things is not only during this period of time for me, was I working a lot of very late nights. It's like, okay, working a few late nights, okay, that's okay. But never prior to that had I ever actually worked all night on anything. Never during school, never during my prior work, never. It was just like, okay, late hours maybe, but not all the time. So during this time, I actually had to, not only was I working late nights a bunch of nights, but there were 5 all-nighters that I had to do to get stuff out. And at that point, it was one of the things that's like, for me, it nearly ended my relationship with wife. So this is a big deal, because it's like, can you handle the fact that your work could consume your life to the point that does it still work? So in some cases, like if you have no external relationships with other people and you're just excited to work all the time, it works great. And that may be exciting to deal with other people. But on the other hand, a lot of this, maybe most of us, have other things that are external. So in terms of the work-life balance, litigation is not as good as patent prosecution. Patent prosecution is very stable work, work reasonable hours, and we get things done, and have these other parts of your life that are going. And I also see that in terms of, because I looked at the number of hours billed by our associates. Typically in patent prosecution, people are billing on the order of a little over 1,900 hours per year. It's like everybody's in that ball. You got some litigators who are billing 2,400, 2,700, 3,000 hours in 1 year, and I wonder, it's like, how could somebody have a life and do that? But I see the data. It's like, yes, there are people who are working those sorts of hours. Yeah.
What's the average?
Well, so for patent prosecution, our average is like low 1900s, but for litigation, it's certainly well above 2,000. It's probably like on the order of 2,200 or so. Yeah.
How easy is it to pivot if you're in litigation for, I don't know, a year, a couple of years, and you're like, I want to do something?
Yeah, that's a good question, because that's kind of where I was too. And it's a little bit tricky to pivot from litigation to prosecution, because, and the key reason being that you're already, say a third-year associate. A third-year associate in patent prosecution would have a whole lot of experience in patent prosecution, and so your billing rates are already higher than they ought to be based upon your experience level. So it's a little bit tricky. In my case, there are 2 things that happened. One was that I was always doing some patent prosecution, so it wasn't like I had 0 experience. And the other thing is I took a 1-year seniority drop in order to do it as well. So you can, and so first of all, it is a little bit tricky to do it because of that. The second thing is that not all firms would make that easy. Fortunately, Morgan Lewis is pretty easy, because patent prosecution and patent litigation are under the same umbrella, and it's like moving between the two, not a problem. So there's the issue of not having the experience, and then the second issue, if you're at a firm that allows that. Going the other way, from prosecution to litigation, is easier because, again, because of the economics. It's easier to say, okay, well, you know a bunch about patents, you've got this. So that, we can afford to do that. So it's easier to go that way than from litigation to prosecution. What I would say is, if you think that's a possibility, and say, I think I want to do litigation, but I'm not entirely sure, do some patent prosecution so that you're not, because if you're doing just litigation and then 2 years later say, I don't want to do this anymore, and you have zero experience in patent prosecution, it's going to be really hard to pivot. So if you think it's a possibility, get at least some experience with that. And the second thing is, make sure that the firm that you're working for enables that. Good, very, very good question. That's important. Okay. And any other question about work-life balance? But I think this is really important, and I don't think we're necessarily thinking about that enough.
If you're a litigator, how easy it is to just stay on district court so you don't have to do like ITC?
It's sometimes kind of, you have some control over what you do, but it's not, and it's like, if there's a case that comes along, it's like we really need to, it's kind of hard to say, oh, well, I really don't want to do that. So it's a little bit tough. And so like the ITC case that I was on, we actually, it's kind of like consumed everybody, because it was like both sides were actually suing each other in the ITC. So it was like it was literally consumed everybody, and there's nobody who's going to be outside of that. So it's sometimes you can control it, but not necessarily. Excitement. Guess which way excitement favors? Well, litigation, because it is very exciting. When you win, or even just winning on a summary judgment motion or something, it's like it can be very exciting. And in a lot of cases, you're sharing. It's not just that you're sitting in the desk, your desk by yourself, being excited about this. You're sharing it with others. You're sharing it with the team and say, boy, we did a great job on this, and so that's something that's, I don't want to downplay it. It's like that can be very invigorating. Yeah, we won something big, and it's like particularly at the end, or and that's not just at the district court level, because there are cases like, oh, maybe we lose at the district court level. And then you appeal to the federal circuit, and you get the case reversed. And it's like maybe you're the defendant, and we're going to have to pay $100 million, but then you go to the federal circuit for reverses, and now we're not about to pay anything. So sometimes the excitement can occur later. So that's a good factor. Yeah, vacations and scheduling. So I personally want to be able to schedule a vacation in advance and say, yes, I'm going to travel to this location, whatever it is. In litigation, it's tough. Two ways in which litigation makes that more difficult. One is it's sometimes hard to predict when you're going to be needed. It's like, okay, because things can change quickly. Say, yeah, we need you here. That vacation that you've been planning, maybe you won't be able to go. Maybe you have to change that. The other thing that can happen in litigation is that maybe you were, working really hard. You're leading up to the trial, and then the case settles, and now you don't have work. So people who are very good at litigation know how to take that into a great opportunity. Say, great, I'll go on vacation now, and can do that. For me, that's a little harder to do, but there's some people who do that. I mean, one of the person in the office next to me is a great litigator, and he's done that. He's like, oh yeah, case settled, I took a trip, and has had great fun. Maybe take a couple weeks. It's like, and so if you can dynamically adapt quickly to changes, both in terms of maybe postponing something you want to do or immediately scheduling something that you haven't planned in advance. And if you can do that, then litigation works. But if you're a person who likes to have control of your schedule and say, yeah, I want to be able to plan this in advance, and as well as being able to, if you have family that you want to schedule it with, that can be hard on others as well to say, oh yeah, well, we may be able to go here, but maybe something, or so. This is something to think about in terms of your planning. Long-term objectives. I think a lot of times when you're in law school, you're just sort of thinking about what am I going to do as a first-year associate, or maybe a second-year associate. If you think really. But the fact is that that's just the first start of just the beginning of your career, and so it's useful to think about, well, where might the career go, and be thinking not just 1 or 2 years ahead, but 10 years ahead. And I think, and not like you're saying, oh, well, I have to get there, but just sort of think about where you might be in 10 years. And so a couple things to think about. So a lot of people who start in big law end up moving in-house into other positions. That's normal, and in fact, the majority of associates do not stay, and the majority end up doing something different. And that's true for both litigation and prosecution. I remember when I was an early associate, seeing multiple people in prosecution leave to go work in-house, and it just seemed odd to me at the time. And now it's like, oh yeah, this is just completely normal. Some people want to, they don't want to necessarily become a partner in a big law firm. Becoming a partner also means, it means even more work than being an associate. So it's not like it becomes easier as a partner. It's a lot of work, and not everybody wants that. So in terms of that work-life balance scale, it's like, well, if you go even one step further, it's like working in-house is frequently even better in terms of the work-life balance, because the requirements on your time are better. You won't, in general, won't get paid as much, but it's a good balance. On the other hand, I have one of my colleagues who was in law school here with me. She got a position as I think the general counsel at some startup, and then she made millions off of an IPO. So she's doing much better than I am. So if you get the right place, you can make lots, but you can't assume that. So lots of people go to work in-house, and for lots of reasons, and that's fine. And if you're in a law firm, particularly big law, and you're thinking about moving, don't worry about talking to people about that, and don't say, oh, I'm going to hide this. I don't want to let them know that I might think about that. It's okay. In fact, a lot of times, big law, if I have associates who then go to work for another law firm, it's fairly common for that new company to then send us work, because it's like they know the quality of work that we can do. So so it's great. It's just like, do what makes sense for you, and don't worry about that. You say, oh, you're letting somebody down. It's like, no, it's like whatever makes sense for you, do that. So anyway, the long-term objective, think about long-term. Do you want to become a partner, or do you want to work in-house? Do you want to become general counsel someplace? Some people really like the idea of being a general counsel at a company of some size, whatever size like this, and that could be a good thing. For me, it's like being a general counsel. It's like, I really want to focus on IP. Another position sort of that's important is like maybe to be a senior director over all of IP. A colleague who started the same time I did, she worked at Morgan Lewis for 7 years, then worked in-house, and then just this past year got the job that she really wanted as senior director of IP at firm, and she's completely ecstatic about it. It's great for her. So be thinking about the options. It's not. Don't just assume, yeah, I'm going to be, I want to become a partner here, because that isn't necessarily the right thing for you. So just be thinking about the options. I think you had a question.
What sort of places would you, like, what sort of options would you have? What sort of companies could you be like in-house counsel or general counsel? Could you give examples? You said
Okay.
startups.
Yeah, so and actually that's, yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because that brings up another point. So patent, if you're in patent prosecution, then any even moderately sized company is going to have in-house counsel dealing with patent prosecution. Usually the in-house counsel is dealing more with sort of managing outside counsel. So it's actually kind of good to have worked at say big law. It's like, okay, so I know what the law firms do, so I know how to manage them. And so that's a lot of times it's a little bit less substantive and more strategic in terms of saying, okay, yeah, these are the things we are developing, the products or services, and therefore, what do we need to protect, and so on. So it's a little more of a strategic rather than hands-on working on an individual patent. So lots of opportunities in patent prosecution across a whole array of sizes of companies. On the other hand, litigation, there's less opportunity to work in-house there because litigation typically requires, there are not very many companies that actually have a big in-house litigation group, because most companies aren't in litigation all the time. It's more of a rare event, so they don't tend to hire. So there's less in-house opportunities for litigators. On the other hand, sometimes preparation for being a general counsel, doing litigation work might be useful, because somebody who's a general counsel better know more than just patent prosecution, and so having some experience in litigation. So being a litigator could prepare maybe for some other in-house position, which leads to a general counsel later. But from what I have seen, I've seen a lot more people go from patent prosecution to in-house positions. Yeah, litigation tends to stick with the big law firms. Yeah.
Do you ever see people going in-house to universities?
I have not seen that yet, but I mean, universities have internal counsel. So I mean, in that sense, they'd be like any other company. It's like, yeah, we need in-house counsel. So I don't know any person who's done that, but it would be, in that sense, it'd be just like any other company. So yeah, it could work. Universities might add a little bit of a flavor to it, because sometimes universities have a lot more. Sometimes have some very exciting research, and the in-house counsel can be monitoring. Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to go to a couple of other, so we've got a couple factors, now some other considerations. So, how close do you think your work as a summer associate, how close does that correspond to what you'd later do as an actual associate? The interesting thing is that in patent prosecution, it's actually relatively close, because like the work you do as a summer associate in patent prosecution, I mean, you'll have real work to do, working on a real application. Maybe get to draft something. So patent prosecution, it's a little bit, it's not too far distant from what the real work is like. Patent litigation, on the other hand, it's probably not very representative of what you'll end up doing, because what can a summer associate do for litigation at this early stage? And so it tends to be very specific, simple, discrete research projects. And real litigation doesn't have that much of it, but that tends to be what summer associates do. So I don't think a summer associate program is going to give you that much, as much realistic view of what litigation is like. And so my recommendation is if you are interested in litigation and are a summer associate, spend time talking to the first and second year associates and ask them, what is it really like? And you know, talk to them as much as you can, because that's what you really want to find out about. Because you don't want to say, oh yeah, I was a summer associate, now I know what it's like. It's like, well, not really. And actually, for me, I was summer associate for 2 years, and my second summer I was doing just litigation. I was on one case, and I was actually billing like 40 hours a week on it, and and so in that case, my second summer actually was pretty close to what it was really like. That's what it was. Okay. What should you do if you're not happy? The answer is really simple. Don't. I mean, so it depends on question. What's making you unhappy? You know, is it unhappiness due to the people, or is it due to the work? If it's due to the people, and this happens, you know, then the solution is really simple. Go work for another law firm. There's a lot of law firms around, and so if you're not happy with one you're at, it's very easy. As soon as you are an associate, like probably day one, you will start getting emails and phone calls from recruiters wanting to find other jobs for you. So it's extremely easy to change law firms if you're not happy, and you should. It's like there are plenty of good law firms. So don't if you get to the point and say, you know, I'm not happy here, just go to another law firm. There's plenty of good law firms. On the other hand, if you're not happy with the work, and so like the question of, well, maybe you're doing prosecution or litigation, you say, maybe I'm not as happy with this. The same thing, it's like, well, maybe you start making a transition. And particularly if it's a transition from litigation to prosecution, do it as early as possible so you don't end up with not being able to do it. So the point is, if you're not happy, make a change. And it's either changing law firms or change the work you do. And the point is, it's not difficult to do. So don't be unhappy. You probably heard about rainmakers. And there's some rainmakers who are they're really big money. I'm not one of them. So the rainmakers, and this we saw earlier, we were talking about the difference between extroverts versus introverts. And one of the things about extroverts is they've got big networks, they have lots of people, they've got lots of friends, and those friends they know send work the way, and then once you've done work, then other people know you, so they send you more work, and so it kind of snowballs. And so the people who are rainmakers can make a very large amount of money, whereas the rest of us will do well, but not the same as being a rainmaker. And along these lines, regardless of whether you're in prosecution or litigation, I strongly recommend working on and building your network at an early stage. And it's not even too early to start now. I mean, make sure you've got that you're connected with your friends and so on LinkedIn and other things, and keep in contact with them, because a lot of times it's establishing those connections over a long period of time. It's much harder to just go out to somebody today and say, hey, do you want to give me some work? That just doesn't work very well. It's these longer term relationships that you build over a much longer period of time. So, and that's something that I personally didn't know enough about, so I didn't actually start doing that until very late in the game, long after I was already a partner. And so I'm way behind where other people are, because I didn't know to start that early. So start that early. Even if you're not going to be a huge rainmaker, bringing in some work is good, and so establishing those connections and sticking with them is really really important. And like I said, it's not too early to start now. If anybody can figure out why am I talking about a pigeonhole? So one of the things that, regardless of whether you're doing prosecution or litigation, other partners are going to evaluate your work and recognize what you do well and what you do that is not so good. And therefore, it will tend to reinforce certain areas of strength and give you less opportunity to grow in areas that you're not as good. And so over a period of time, that tends to lead to being pigeonholed into a certain niche, whatever it is. And so you want to, and you know, again, it can take a while. It's not going to have to be something that occurs overnight. So be aware of it and see if you're making sure that you are doing the work you're interested in. So in my early part of my career, even when I was doing both litigation and prosecution, I was just focused on the technical analysis. And one of the things that I was not doing was taking depositions or other things. It's like, well, any good litigator should be taking depositions by the time they're into the first year or into the second year as associate. And I wasn't. So I was already being ditched by the first year into saying, oh yeah, Davis is the guy who's going to do with the really technical stuff. And if you're happy with the niche you're in, great. But if you're not, you got to recognize it early and make sure that you're getting the opportunities to do the work you want. In particular, if you want to have a career as a litigator, you better see, well, what should a litigator be doing? They better be taking depositions and doing other key things, by the second year. If you're not, then there's a problem. It's not, the trajectory is not working. So just be aware of that. Okay, this is also something. What if you change or the firm changes? Because given enough time, things do change. And both of those are quite possible. You could say, oh yeah, it's like maybe I did like this before, but I don't now. And firms can also change. So when there's turnover in terms of the people or other things, that there can be changes. And so be aware of that. So even if you are ecstatic with the firm you're working for right now, a year or two from now, things can be different. And so you have to be able to adapt to that. And I want to give a good example that just occurred this past week. So I've got a colleague at the firm who has been working for the firm forever, a very, very, very long time. She's at the top of her field. She's happy with her work. She's in great shape physically and mentally. She just wants to continue working until she drops dead at her desk. That's what she'd like to do. Plan on working there forever. But she's 70 years old. Our firm has a policy that once you turn 65, you can only continue working if you get specific permission and request from the chair of the firm. And they didn't do that. And so here she is. She's planning on working forever with the firm, and was not permitted to do that. And so she's going to move to another law firm at age 70, just because she needs to. Because she's a person who, in terms of seeing people enjoy the work, I've never seen anybody enjoy work more than she does. It's like she works in labor and employment, and just like the amount of fun stuff that she deals with all the time is just amazing. So there's an example where somebody is just basically circumstances changed, so she had to adapt to that in a way that was unexpected for her. So be aware of the fact that either you or the firm may change, and be ready to work with her. And then how can you compare law firms? That's something everything we've set up at the point doesn't matter law firms. And actually, I'm not even going to spend enough time on this today. Fact is, there are a lot of good law firms, so I wouldn't, yeah, do what you're doing in terms of finding law firms. But if you find a good law firm and you're happy, then stay. And if you're not happy, then you move on. Sometimes I actually wonder sort of how well we do both as a law firm and as students in terms of finding good matches. And then the question I have is like, are we doing better than average in terms of actually making good matches? And I actually don't know the answer to that question. It's like sometimes I think if we just, rather than spending all this time and effort in terms of all this interviewing, what if we just randomly assign students to law firms? How good would it be? And it probably ended up being pretty good. But anyway, so continue what you're doing, but I wouldn't worry about the law firms too much. And then I don't know. I think we've got 5 minutes left. My timing wasn't too bad. Any other questions, or we could also I'll see you around. We'll ask other questions too. Yeah.
What kind of question would you recommend us asking during the interview to make sure that we are suitable or good fit to the work that we want to work with?
Yeah. Okay. So her question is like, what questions should you ask during the interview to get more information about the firm? And the tricky part is I'm not sure if there's any clear answer to that, because it's sort of the interviewing process in some sense kind of, if you look at this sort of like from a game theory standpoint, you've got the students, it's just trying to find the best firm, you got the firms that are just trying to find the best students, and so everybody has a great incentive to a sense sort of misrepresent themselves. I mean, the reality is that there's an incentive to do that. So just talking to an individual person during an interview, I wouldn't say is necessarily going to be a great indicator. But so in a sense, but to try to answer your question somewhat, it would be to ask questions that actually, rather than just something where somebody can make up the information, it's something that actually requires. The questions along the lines of like, okay, so why are you continuing to work here at this law firm? But even then, it's still, it's like any question you ask, there's always opportunity to give answers that aren't necessarily accurate. So I think the best thing is actually, when you can, is to talk to associates, junior associates, like first and second year associates. If there's any of those who are in the interviewing, or even afterwards, and say, who are some of the people who work for you? Can I talk to them? Because I think those are the people who are going to be the most honest, and probably also most. They've just been in law school, so they're going to be the most kind of thinking along the same lines as you are. So I would, rather than assuming that a senior partner, senior partner is not necessarily that in tune with what you're doing. So I would ask to talk to junior associates. Well, I hope that was useful. I mean, as long as it prompted you to think about it, that's what the whole goal was. Think about it. It may or may not be the right decision, but I think you know what Thank you so much.
Quick reminder, if you haven't, it'll just take 30 seconds.